Okay, the next question is from Anonymous. What influenced the look of Timothy Dalton's Rossellon in The End of Time? Also, what was it like working with James Bond? Okay, first of all, when Timothy was cast, he was in America. And I had quite a lot of emails from him about his costume. And he sent me the most marvellous set of measurements I've ever seen in my life. He'd had a body scan done for a film. And I mean, you know, down to his fingernails. It was amazing. It was every measurement you could ever want. And we spoke on the phone. Russell wanted him to have Time Lord robes on. Now, Russell's big thing with Time Lords and robes is that they should all be gorgeous and beautiful and rich and operatic and lovely and luscious and red. And that's really something, you know, which we wanted to do. Now, we did have Time Lord collars made, as people know, for that episode. They were cast from the originals. They were covered in leatherette and they were sprayed gold. The reasons for those fans out there that they were sprayed gold and they weren't all different other colours mixed in is because there was going to be a large element of CGI in the Time Lord shots, but we didn't quite know what. So by making them all gold, we knew that we weren't going to have a problem when they decided to multiply, because we didn't know if they were going to multiply by 10, by 20, by 100, and all the robes had a red element to them. Now, with his robe, I had that made. I was very lucky because I found the most amazing Panay velvet, and it was a one-off demonstration piece that had a gold design printed on it that was a sample, which I bought, and I just about had enough fabric to make this robe. Like when I say just enough, I said I had a few inches left over. It was that tight. But just by magic, it just happens. I was looking for velvets and found this piece one day, and it was brilliant. The idea behind the costume underneath is that Eros Lynn, who directed the piece, wanted him to look like he was a man who did fight in battles, that it had a contemporary feel to it, and that he should look like he fought proper battles, that he'd been in proper wars. He wasn't just a figurehead. So he had the combat trousers underneath, which I actually bought several pairs to try on Timothy at the fittings, and he had jack boots on. And then he had the leather piece on as well, which were actually old costume pieces, which we adapted. He also had the Gallifrey symbol on his chest piece, which we had those moulded for the Gallifrey collars, and I decided to put one on the chest piece. It's absolutely scripted that he opens his cloak. The reason for that, you know, that was a script-driven thing. That's what Russell wanted to happen. And also the armour arm was also in the script, and it was specifically written with a particular colour in mind. It was like these silvery blues. I found a piece of armour and we bought all different car sprays in varying blues and silvers and sprayed, did test sprays and showed Eros until he found the colour that he was happy with. The fastening on the cloak had a magnet on it because Timothy had to open it quite quickly. So we did it with a magnet, which had its own problems actually. But actually, I only had a 2-hour window to fit Timothy from him flying over and arriving in the country. And also, I had to keep a secret that he was being cast. So I'd arranged a fitting for him at the costume house, but I hadn't actually given his name. I smuggled him into the building. I'd had the cloaks made. I took the cloaks with me. I took all my shopping with me. We used a fitting room and we did the fitting. During the fitting, Timothy mentioned to me that he'd just flown over and he'd been on the plane, and the flight crew had asked him what he was doing coming over to London, and he mentioned to him that he'd come over to do Doctor Who. So I said, oh, that's great. That was meant to be a secret, but hey, you know, I smuggled him out of the building after our fitting, and then he was put in a car and he was travelling up to Cardiff. And I then also drove to Cardiff because later that day we were going to be fitting the Time Lord collar on him, because Russell wanted to see what Time Lord collar would look like. And there'd been many discussions about these Time Lord collars because they're not very practical. They're made of fiberglass. Russell said, well, it would be nice just to see if Timothy could try one on what the effect would be like. I drove up to Cardiff and we waited for Timothy to arrive. He was running late due to the fact that the driver that had picked him up had actually delivered him to the wrong studios, whereupon he'd walked into the studio reception and said, "Oh, I'm Timothy Dalton, I'm here for Doctor Who." So by this time, of course, lots of people knew he was in Cardiff and that he was doing Doctor Who. You know, all my endeavours to keep a secret didn't go to work. They were blown big time. In terms of the collar, the reason he never wore a Time Lord collar is because actually these collars are very heavy. They're made of fiberglass, and when you put them on and they sit on the shoulders, if you want to put your arm up in the air, as Timothy does quite a lot in the episode, the whole collar rises, and they're just not practical. You can't really move on them. Those collars really were only ever designed for people to stand still and look straight ahead. They're not really practical for any other purposes. So that was sort of a bit of the story behind that costume. In terms of, you know, working with James Bond, well, I have to say Timothy was delightful to work with, very charming, very sweet. I think his son's a bit of a Doctor Who fan, so I think the buzz for him was more the fact that he'd been Doctor Who and James Bond, and that was, you know, for him a bit of a kind of nice moment, actually. But it was lovely to have him around. Also, I think Dave and John Sim really enjoyed having him around there for those last episodes, and they had quite a lot of laughs and, you know, shared a lot of stories.